Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So the next under the company is set closing date. Click on set closing date. So at the end you can find out closing date. What is closing date? Date through which books are closed. Basically the date, this is the date at which you can close your book of account. Let us say, for example, in the case of my company, 31st December, at 31st December, I want to close the book of account. So that 31st December can be considered as closing date. Now it depends on you whether you can provide a closing date for your company in the Quickbook or not. It's still not set. It means closing date is not provided. But if you want to provide, then you can click on this one, right? See what is the purpose of this one. If you provide a closing date, then Quickbook will display a warning or require a password when saving a transaction date or before the closing date. Let us say, for example, I want to provide this date. Let us say, for example, I want to provide 31st July. 31st July is the closing date in the case of my company. So when I save this one, when my accountant try to enter any transaction on this date or before this date, then Quickbook provide a warning and ask that, do you have the password to enter into the system? If he or she does not have the password, then he cannot enter a transaction into the system. After this date, of course, they can provide or they can enter transaction in the system. But on this date or before this date, they cannot provide it. Why this is so? This is basically a sort of partition. I have provided this facility, or this Quickbook has provided this facility for us in order to protect the data from the accountant. What do you mean by protecting data from accounting? It means that at the end of the year, definitely we have to provide the accounting reports. If you want to provide the accounting report, usually accounting reports are provided for a specific period of time. So that period of time, for example, in our case is 31st July. So we have to provide data, we have to provide accounting information up to 31st July. Then if you provide the closing date, then accountant cannot enter transaction before this, but he of course he or she can enter a transaction after this date. If he or she provide information to the system after this, so that will be considered as accounting information for the next accounting period. If he or she provide accounting information to the system, definitely that one should be considered as accounting information for this accounting period. So when you provide the closing date, it means you don't want the accountant to provide more information in this accounting period. So that is why it limits the access area of the accounting only after this date. So before this date, he or she cannot enter anything to the system. So this is a sort of information. Or not only for this purpose. For example, up to this time you have worked on the company, but after this time Mr. Ahmad will work in the system. So you provide a closing date, and through the closing date, you can identify whether the data which are entered in the system is before this date or whether the data which are entered in the system is after this date. If it is before this date or on this date, it means you have already entered the transaction into the system. If it is, or if the transaction is after this date, then easily you can identify or easily you can understand that yes, those data are not entered by you, but that one is entered by others. Why? Because this was the closing date. Also, you can give some exclusion, for example, exclude estimate, sales order, purchase order from closing date restriction. So these things can be excluded. You can exclude estimate, you can exclude sales order, you can exclude purchase order. But in my case, for example, I'm not going to provide an exclusion. So I'm just provided this date as a closing date, right? Then provide a password. Let us say, for example, this is the password. Then set this one. Then say okay. Now, go in the company, create an invite. Create an invite, for example, for one of the customer by the name of Ihsan Allah. Close this part. Okay. By one of the customer by the name of Ihsan Allah, we want to sell, for example, something like, we can say books. How many books? This is the amount. This is today's date, right? This is 2nd of August. Definitely, if you save, it is possible to save it. Okay, and let's provide the password. Save it, it is possible. Now select another customer, for example, by the name of Hotra, and provide item, for example, food, for example. Now change the date. Change the date up to 31st July, and save and close. Can you save it? No. This modification will affect transaction from closing period and could also affect the previous financial reports. So if it means if you enter this transaction, this will affect on the previous financial reports. So you don't have the permission. You must enter the closing date password to make this change. It means if you are authorized, then you should have the password. If you're not authorized, it means you should not be able to enter the transaction in the system to affect the previous accounting financial report. So this date is not possible. Can you select any date before this? Definitely that's also not possible. Date after this closing date, after this is possible. For example, 1st of August and so on. But date on date and before that, it is not possible, right? If you select once again, for example, this date, Quickbook provide you again, you must enter this date. This modification will affect the transaction from closing periods and could also affect the previous financial report. You're not able to change the previous financial report. If you want to change, then you should have the permission. And let us say, for example, you want to provide the password 12345. Then you can do it. Then you can enter this transaction. Unless you have the password, you cannot provide that. You cannot enter the transaction into the system. Right? So this was the purpose of close. So now let us create, for example, invoice. Estimates, for example, create estimates. If you create estimates, for example, for one of our customer by the name of Mariam, let us say she want to purchase keyboard from the business. Quantity, for example, she want to purchase 100, and this is the cost. This is the total 3,300. So which date we want to provide? Once again, provide 31st. Can you do it? Again, it is not possible, right? So now let me change the closing date. Let me change the closing date. Where's the closing date? Under the company, set closing date. Click on this one. Let us exclude some of these items. Exclude estimates. Do not change the password. Do not change this one, but exclude the estimates. Now let us see whether estimation is possible or not. On 31st, can you save this one? Yeah, now it is saved. Why it is possible? Because you have excluded. If you exclude it from closing date, that is also possible, before date or after date. But if it is not excluded, definitely you cannot enter that one into the system. Also, you can open this closing date from the edit and preference. You can click on the accountant, on the accountant, then at the end there's a set closing date. So if you want to remove it, then remove this part as well as remove the passwords. Right? Now save this one. Now there is no once again closing date. You can do anything as you wish.